On All About Fitness today, Katy Bowman, actually you're returning. I interviewed you a long time ago when I first started the podcast, but we're here today to talk about your new book, Grow Wild. How are you doing today, Katy?
I'm doing great. Thank you for having me and letting me stand up while we talk.
Well, we're just saying that I'm more comfortable. I'm more comfortable talking, doing these interviews from a standing position. I find if I'm seated, I become just a little bit. I don't know if you notice that too. I mean, your whole book is built around movement, but what is that difference? Why do we feel so different seated and standing?
I don't know about everyone else, but for me, the organization of my thoughts, it's like, and they've done research on creativity and sort of assembling ideas that when people are walking, it's a little bit easier than sort of, sitting around a conference table. And so my whole life, I have found that I am just better full stop when moving. And that's not just physically, it's really mentally, functionally, and all the things I have to do is better with a dose of movement for sure.
Well, like yourself, I'm finishing up a book and I'm going through my final chapter edits right now. So yesterday is a perfect example, and as I was kind of reviewing your book last night and this morning, getting ready for this conversation, it drove home because yesterday is one of those days, and I'm sure you have those days too, where you're creating all day, where you're kind of focused on your work, and then what happens after a period of time? Do you notice, Katy, when you're stuck in the same position for a period of time? Do you notice your body feeling different? Do you notice your brain functioning different?
Yeah, it just stops. Like I mean, it'd be the same as really the way that I would feel after fasting. Like you're tuning into the signals so much more than you don't let yourself feel hunger that often, and so you for me who moves a lot, when I sit, the signals of move more or movement hunger are so robust. They're hard not to follow. Like if I'm really listening to my body, I'm not going to sit down too long because I just can't. Like you just, my word count goes down. If I'm speaking, I almost start slurring. It's like I can't, like muscles in my mouth really depend on the muscles of my legs being somewhat primed. So it just definitely helps me to be alert and
Well, isn't
function
that
well.
funny that our bodies get so tuned in? I mean, that's exactly what I did. I got out, pushed away, and went out for like a 2 mile walk around the neighborhood. And that gets us to that's perfect because the first question I wanted to ask was the concept of nutritious movement. And you talk about fasting, seated for a period of time is sort of like fasting, fasting of movement. I like that correlation. But what's this concept of nutritious movement, and why is it so important?
Well, so it starts with this idea that movement is a nutrient, and so we have to go like, what's a nutrient? And so nutrients are almost all dietary, but we also have sunlight, so we recognize that there are these things that have to be put into our body, or they're an input, if you will, that start with either food going into our mouth or sunlight hitting the skin, but that triggers a biochemical response. So you have a compound, something external, and it goes in, and then it affects your cellular behavior. So nutrients are compounds where, in their absence, there are predictable symptoms that happen really across the board. There might be some variance, but like there are tissues that break down in particular ways without particular nutrients. And that's how they were all discovered. They were discovered where there would be these, unique pods of people where they set up sort of natural experiments. So the classic example is vitamin C. You have prisoners, or you have sailors, groups of people that might have an adequate caloric intake, but they were missing something. And it's like, what's this mysterious disease that all these people doing this one particular thing do? And over time, hundreds of years, they figured out it's food, or more specifically, it's what's not in the food. And so our vitamins were each discovered by this process of going, a mass of people over a long period of time had something that really couldn't be fixed in any other way, and they're like, oh, a nutrient. So what I say, and I started this conversation really in Move Your DNA, which I think you and I discussed when I was on, back when I was young. Um, um, and it was the idea that movement is also an input. So I talk about mechanotransduction. So when you move something, what's really happening is your cells are being squished or tense, they're being pushed or pulled in some way. And when cells are pushed and pulled, that push and pull just like food or sunlight hitting your body creates a response of biochemistry. So even something mechanical can turn into chemistry. So just like a food compound, chemistry can turn into chemistry. Sunlight can create a chemical response. So does movement, and it's local. It's both systemic, your whole body, but it's also local. You know, if you're moving your arm, the cells that are being squished aren't necessarily everywhere in your body, and that's why we have systemic and local adaptations to movement. You can do a lot of whole body stuff, but it won't necessarily target a particular area in the body. It's moving the parts that are involved in systemic responses, so hearts and lungs and things like that. So my point of view, my contribution is really to movement science, is that movement is in fact a nutrient. It meets all the same requirements. It's just we're not there yet. We have yet to recognize we're not using the language anyway. So right now, similar to food, if you go to physical therapy or to a trainer and you're like, I have this problem, they're gonna be like, yes, we know that when you have this problem, there are some muscle groups that are missing. You know, there are some nutrients that you're missing around. Maybe you get a lot of movement in one area, but not so much in others. And so what I am saying, and I probably call it out most specifically or explicitly in Grow Wild, is we are already using a nutrient framework. We're just not using that language. And if we did use that language, it would make it much easier for people to recognize that many times what they have are symptoms of movement nutrient deficiency. So we as a group, as a culture, are sort of we're in a movement drought, so to speak. So even those who move regularly, you know, who move more than anyone else in a sedentary culture, relatively speaking, we're still pretty sedentary compared to other groups of humans that move a lot more. So we have a compound issue of one, not taking in that many movement calories a day. You know, we're shooting for 60 minutes. We're shooting for, 60 minutes 7 times a week. 420 minutes, right, out of a total of 10,000 minutes a day. So we're looking at a super small number of movement calories per day. And then that movement nutrition framework is, and all of your parts are supposed to get some movement during the 60 minutes that you set up a day. That's like going to a nutritionist and be like, okay, I'm going to eat 150 calories today. You tell me exactly what foods I should be eating for optimal wellness. And it's like, the first thing is, I don't know if we need to keep having that conversation about, if I'm only going to eat 100 calories, what should I be eating? Like, let's expand. Going, I'm going to need you to eat like 15, like let's go with 1,000 or 2,000 or 35 and then 3,500. And then we'll start talking about all of the ways you can get nutrients within that framework. And so nutritious movement is not really an analogy, because I'm saying that it's a literal nutrient, but it'll be taken as an analogy right now, which is, okay, so if I start kicking my movement minutes up, or let's start with movement seconds, if we can't feel like overwhelmed by a minute. If I kick my movement minutes up, what are the food groups that I'm supposed to be pulling from? Like, how can I think about that? And then how to like,
well, real quick, if I can jump in for a second before we talk about the specific movement nutrients, because you talked about this for just a second, and I want to harp on this, because one of the interviews that listeners just heard a couple episodes ago was with Dr. Jim Stray Gunderson, talking about blood flow restriction. And he talked about the tension in the muscles coming from kind of the hydraulic tension in the muscles. And what you just did, Katy, I'm calling it out for listeners, because you're talking about cells and talking about moving cells within the body. So blood flow restriction manipulates the cells in a different way. But what it's doing is creating that force, what you identify as mechanotransduction. So all I'm trying to do is just tie in that little, I want to tie in the two episodes together, because what you're talking about is coming out from a holistic view, where blood flow restriction is looking at restricting movement in a certain muscle, restricting the cellular movement, the blood flow movement, which affects cells. And so you're coming at it from a holistic view of looking at all the cells together. And what I want to ask about, you just touched on this, and I thought you did it so brilliantly. I love the way that you identify that movement is counterculture, because, and I love the analogy you're creating between nutrition, Like you wouldn't take, we know that if we remove carbohydrates from our diet or if we remove protein from our diet, it's not good for our body. There'll be a short-term adaptation and it might be good, or there might be a short-term adaptation, but long-term we need all nutrients. And so what is this? Why is movement counterculture? What have we done? How has society evolved in a way that for those of us that are standing for this conversation, why are we viewed as kind of the outliers as opposed to the way it should be viewed?
I mean, culture is a tricky thing. I would say, and I, as anyone if you study movement for long enough, what you realize is you have to start studying sedentarism too, because that's really the bigger issue. If we're like, okay, try to get people to move more, then you have to understand the problem. And so for what I've been able to identify, really has to do with the notion of convenience. We are a culture of convenience, but I think more specific than that is humans are really good at coming up with things. Like we are really good at tinkering. Tinkering is just like the easiest way to say it. And if you ever watch a little kid with a whole bunch of Lego, you're like, oh my God, you made a spaceship. We're so good at breaking things down and then reassembling it into something that has never existed. And we don't necessarily need instructions to do that. It's just something that humans are good, and that's what's gotten us to be this far, I think. But I think that one thing, when I love algebra, so I'm a math-based person and I love algebra. And the nice thing about algebra is you can swap units. So right now we look at convenience as something that saves time. We're stoked. We're like, look at this. I just got this thing and it's going to save me this much time. And with that extra time, I'm going to do all these other things that I want to do. But what we don't recognize is the reason things save time in terms of the technological advances that we are making is because they are actually saving us movement. They're movement reducers. And so it's easy to accept a massive amount of what we are labeling as time-saving conveniences when we're not also paying attention to every one of those time-saving conveniences is also a movement reducing convenience. And so when you're 250 years into this sort of the celebration of the convenient culture, look at and it's manufacturing, right? It's like we're the
it's post-industrial revolution.
It's post-industrial revolution, right? So but humans have been heading in this direction for a long time. I mean, agriculture, which is much older than the Industrial Revolution. I mean, you can be in 60,000 years, but that was too a time-saving step for humans, and it was a movement-saving step. It's like we don't have to walk around anymore. Let's just put the forest where we are. But what's happening is it's exponential now. So the difference between in the human timeline to go from agriculture has been a minute, but Industrial Revolution has been a second. And then to go from post-industrial revolution, 250 years to what we will now, what do we call the time? What do we call the age in which we have a mini computer with amazing computing capacity, and we put it in the hands of every single person, including 6-year-olds, or even younger than that? What do we call that? Because all of those things were, once again, they're reducing movement in some way, or they're turning, I'm just wiggling my thumb right now. They're turning all the movements that we used to do nutritionally throughout the whole body into like a thumb wiggle, and the thumb wiggle is now, I mean, ironically, it's the opposable thumb, but we're doing that. And so I think it's just that it's really not taking a critical look at technologies that we accept, especially in an age now where sedentarism is so pervasive. And there's no one arguing that sedentarism is a good idea. I mean, it's economically disastrous. It's physically disastrous. There's all the side effects, but it's really hard to not call it progress. I mean, we can say progression, but only if we don't really look at sort of the individual experience in some ways, the physical experience.
Well, real quick, if I can interject, because as you're saying that, Katy, and as I was reading this, I was thinking about how over the last year, it really has. I think one of the things about being the COVID crisis of 2020 and into early 2021 is the fact that we have done more. Like I referenced going out for a walk, and just one of my mentors, Cedric Bryant from the American Council on Exercise, was just quoted in an article in Time magazine how people are walking more, they're cycling more, they're going to more parks. So in one sense, in your observation, and I know it's not a scientific study, but in your observation, has the past year actually been a good thing for family units to kind of come together a little bit more and maybe to get out and do more movement, to go on walks together? Has that been one positive? We take everything that we've gone through with the pandemic. I like to look at the positive. Has that been one positive thing that's kind of happened in the last year? Is that maybe we're like saying, hey, if we're stuck together, if I'm not going into my office, if I'm not sitting in my car an hour a day, maybe I can get out and find more opportunities to move by getting out for a walk around the neighborhood. Has that been something you've observed?
Well, I have my observations in my own community, but I think probably more relevant would be at the end of Grow Wild. I wrote the book, started 2 years ago, but of course it's coming out during the pandemic, right? That started in 2019 and is still here in 2021. And so the observations done, and I added some research into that because it's a book about kids. Sedentarism was already a huge thing. And so there are many researchers already quantifying the effects of this particular pandemic on a pandemic that had previously been identified, which was global sedentarism. So there's a really great paper called The Tale of Two Pandemics that I recommend reading. That's linked in the back of that book. You'll find it in the references there. So what they found is not so different than what you're saying. What they found was total movement is down overall. Total movement is down overall. This is in kids, but I think the trend is similar in adults. But the movement that is being gotten is different than the movement that people used to do. They are now walking outside. They're using their own neighborhoods for movement, where before that wasn't where we moved, right? We've changed where movement happens. It's over there in a specialized movement place. And so it took everyone, I would say, many months, maybe even a year, maybe it's still happening, to figure out, if I don't have the place to move, where do I move? And so like people are, they're thinking about, well, I have to make a space in my house, or I have to use my neighborhood. Another side effect was many people don't move in their yard, including kids in their neighborhoods, because the neighborhoods aren't safe to move in, namely for traffic and for car. I mean, it's basically vehicles that everyone's using to drive to their specialized places, make it so that kids really can't use the neighborhood safely or without a parent, being there the entire time. And since parents don't have the time to be there the entire time, it's like, then you need to be inside. You need to come inside so that I can go do my thing. But what the pandemic did was allowed kids, because vehicular traffic was down, some cities actually closed streets to make it safe, to encourage, like, we have to make space, outside space. We've gotten rid of the outside space for people to move in. We didn't realize that until these specialized places for movement were shut. And then we looked, it was like, oh my gosh, we had gotten rid of all the places for movement. So I think that trend is positive, and hopefully some of it will last. Yeah.
Well, San Diego did that in a couple of areas in downtown, Katy, where they the restaurants need to move out into the sidewalks. So they shut down the street and the gas lamp, and in Little Italy. So now, you go down there and you're like, what pandemic? Because there's so many people down there because they're walking. And I hope they keep that. I hope they keep that during the weekends. And it's interesting because, again, I'm going to refer to you and I as outliers. I picked where I live specifically because I'm 3/4 of a mile from an entire trail system for mountain biking, hiking, everything. And I wanted to be able to, as much as I love mountain biking, I loathe the idea of putting my bike in a car and driving 45 minutes to get out and ride my bike. I mean, that just to me is the most absurd thing in the world. So I want to choose, personally, I wanted to choose where I can live, where I can easily, I'm a 10-minute ride to the trailhead, and I don't have to get in my car to go, because to me it just seems so ridiculous to be able to do that. And I hope that as we go forward, and as more people are able to work from home, that they kind of get that concept of like, what do you want to be able to do? Now that you don't have to go, now that so many offices are switching and allowing people to do a remote workplace, I really hope that people, so for listeners, start thinking about, where do you really want to live? How do you really want to live? Because now if all of a sudden you can work from home, well, why not look for those opportunities? And I want to come back to Grow Wild, because one of the things I love Because right now, my kids are 6 and 8 years old. And the one thing I'm noticing, Katie, and what really I was thinking about as I was reading this, is we are now at that age where under the age of like 6 and 7, kids are at the playground the entire time, almost the entire time. Like what do you do with your kids? You take them to the playground. But right about now that they're in elementary school, now you're starting to get into organized activities. My daughter just started trying volleyball camp or volleyball team, and my other daughter's going back into soccer. And so I kind of observed that it kind of occurred to me maybe a year ago that the playgrounds are full of kids under the age of like 6, but and then when they get over the age of 6, now we're putting them in structured activities where you have to do this, you have to do that. And coming back to your book, because what I love, you describe children as like an organ. I mean, we're all organisms, but you kind of compare it to the environment and to the forest in terms of the fact. I mean, that's how you start off talking about trees and how trees need the natural environment to flourish. What is it that how have kids' lives changed? I think we know this, but how have kids' lives fundamentally changed over the last maybe 20 or 30 years that as adults we wouldn't really think of? I mean, you kind of referred to the phone, but what have we done to kids that really is affecting their ability to flourish like a tree in the woods?
Well, so, the first line of the book is children are like trees. And I'm speaking about mechanotransduction, because if you go out and look at the trees, the genes of an oak tree or the genes of a poplar tree, they're similar. They're similar in the sense of the physical characteristics of the shape of those trees is genetically set, but the actual girth of the trunk and the number of branches and the ratio of which they branch towards each other is all based on environmental input. And humans are the same way. Our genes are important, but they're a very small element of what you actually see. What you actually see in your own physical frame has a lot to do with the environment in which those genes are expressing themselves. But I think, to your point, you're talking really about the chapter of activities. And so I call out what you're talking about, which is children. And I'm 45, just for context. So, I was an 80s kid. I was in that period of time where parents are often said to do like not a good job because we were always, around and we just left, and we would come back in at night because we're playing the whole day. There were very little organized means of playing. I mean, that wasn't the idea of paying money, to have your kids go be around. The only thing that they really want to do is be with the other bunch of kids. I mean, like that's really what most kids crave, is to be sort of in a multi-aged group without a ton of parents around, and like there's curiosity and exploring. So we've made this transition from, I'm just going to call it play. And the way I talk about it in the book is unstructured time. It would have been before, usually after school. You get out of school where there's more. We always had PE and we had recess. Recess is less organized than PE because PE has a very specific objective that is relating to education, and specifically games and sports, oftentimes, where recess is more like just go run around and, you make up your own games, and you're in some harrowing, I'm sure, very high metal covered in bolt over concrete structures, like, like that was the reality. Like,
I'm only a couple years older than you, but yeah, I'm
you know
just
what I
getting
mean?
that describes every school I went to growing up.
That's right. I mean, it was just all that. And it was masses of children. I mean, there was like, we had one, we had some poor soul who was in charge of keeping everyone under control. They were just sitting there and just sort of watching, blowing a whistle every now and then. But it was just chaos, and masses of people crawling up, and kids are really good. Like, my kids are, how old are they? They're 8.5 and 10. So very similar to your age kids. And I'm really fascinated by when groups of kids are in some precarious, tree house or something high, they zoom past each other, and we're going, slow down, and, like, watch out. And they're just zooming past each other, coming in a fraction of an inch from each other. But they really have an innate sense, especially when it's, been cultivated, of physical space and how they relate to other things. Humans wouldn't have gotten very far for busy knocking each other off of other things. Like there is some innate skill set, just like there is in all animals. But there's been a slow transition, and maybe it's because the neighborhoods have changed. The car culture is zoomed up, so it's not just what's in our hands, the phones. It's not just that sort of technology. I think we've become more industrialized overall, in the sense of freeways and cars and everything. And there's just more people. Like, there's just more people on the planet, and we are trying to figure out how to deal with that, but we're not really trying to deal with it as it relates to movement. We're not thinking of that as something people need, because it's not a nutrient yet. So there's just been a transition from informal, play-based. There's always been games of baseball and soccer, but they're pickup games. There's no uniforms. There's no, these are the rules. It's just kids coming together and honing skills. Like, maybe the game just turns into some other game of kick back and forth, or how many times can you bounce this on your head? Like, they're like, kids are, it's like child-led anything. When you understand this idea of child-led, you realize that humans come with the software and the hardware to refine their own machinery and learn about the environment around them. It does not need to be so hyper structured, and make sure you stay on task. And like, we're just sort of that way right now with our, we work into a scheduled framework. And so, I think that's probably, for what you're speaking of, that's the biggest transition. As far as why it's happened, I'm not sure, but it definitely has happened.
Well, and I'm just thinking, because like where I live, there's a whole playground and park complex not far away, and I can't think of a time when I've seen a group of kids out there just playing a pickup game. You might have kids playing pickup basketball, but everything is so structured. You have the 7 and 8 year olds on from 3 to 4:30, and then you have the 9 and 10 year olds on from 4:30 to 6, and you just have it very structured. You take that away. And it's interesting you say that. I mean, I'm a kid of the 80s too, and I ride my mountain bike now, but in the 80s, I did BMX biking. I raced BMX, and after school, 15, 16, 17 years old even, I'd be out digging dirt. I'd be out building jumps, and I can't tell you how often my dad would get mad at me for losing a shovel or not bringing a shovel back home, because I'd be out digging dirt. And I've been having an ongoing debate with my ex-wife, because one of my youngest daughter wants to try skateboarding. And for parents out there, and I still take my bike every now and then to skate parks here in San Diego. And one of the few places you see pure, unadulterated movement of kids between the ages of 9 and like 15 or 16 is a skate park. When kids are out there on their skateboards, when kids are out there on their bikes, and they're just out there riding, and you might throw down one trick, and I'm going to high five you because you pulled it off, and I'm going to try something else, and I might fall on my bum or whatever. But I just want to say that to parents, because I look at skateboarding, and they'll be interested in your input on this, Katy, because I look at like skateboarding and kids in the skate park. Is it dangerous? Yeah, sure. But so what? Life is dangerous, right? But I look at that as the one place right now that I've seen that kids are just purely free to play between the ages of like maybe 8 and 15. Have you paid much attention to like the skating culture as a component of movement?
Well, I'm from California.
Yeah,
so it's sort of, I mean, there's an element. I'm from Santa Cruz, California.
okay.
So you know what I mean? So it's sort of built in that way, meaning I'm very comfortable with the culture of board sports, I would say, in general. But yeah, I would say that's interesting. I have kids, and I have one specifically that really, just really enjoys wheels and is good at it. This is the kid that really needs to be in constant motion. Now, I have two kids and they both need constant motion, but the kind of constant motion that they need is different. And this is why if you're into child-led and observing really closely what they want, I have one kid who's a climber, mm-hmm. and who likes mastery of whole body skills, and that really are arm dominant. That's her jam, and she never wants to stop. My other kid, he needs constant motion. He doesn't really like to move a ton from point A to point B. He likes balance. So meaning, like, I will find him, we have these log seats, like cut down logs. He'll lay them on its side. And if he's talking to you, he's standing on it, and he's sort of like moving back and forth. If he's making dinner, he's standing on it. Like there's something about him that really needs this. He needs it. He needs it in a way, for kids, I would say, who will sometimes struggle in school because they're too still. He needs to fidget, and his fidgets are always relating to specifically, can I put my feet on something or sit on something that allows me to use my midsection? Now, he's stellar at wheeled sports. He's just preternaturally great at them. Like, they're just innate. And he's been that way since he was like 1. He would always be, he's the slackline kid, it's like it gives his brain something to do so that he can then have the conversation with you. Because if not, he's like, he's doing with his mind what his body is doing, unless you give him that opportunity to do it.
And that's Katie. And for people, if you see this on YouTube, I'm grinning ear from ear and I'm nodding with Katie, because our two kids are exactly alike. Because my older is, I can't wait. I want to get her into rock climbing, and I want to get her into. She's done 1 or 2 of the Ninja Warrior programs, but they haven't been open yet, because she can climb. She can climb anything. She's a climber, and she's been a climber since an early age. And and anytime we're by a tree that she thinks she can climb, I let her climb it. And I'm like, go for it. I mean, make sure it's not on somebody's private property. If we're at a playground, she's like, Dad, I want to climb that tree. I'm like, go for it. The one thing I've always done with my kids, though, is I say, if it's daddy dangerous, that means I want you to take a really hard look at whether or not it's something you should do. Because there's mommy dangerous, which is anything. And then there's daddy dangerous, which is like, hey, if it's daddy dangerous, that means I need you to reconsider it. But my younger daughter is exactly the same as your younger, where I've been watching her in Zoom school this last year, and it's so hard for her because she's like moves around her chair fidgeting the entire time, but then she's paying attention to what's being said. And she's a kid that always, even when she was young and like 14 months old, she was always in motion, always moving, always. And so it's interesting that we have very similar experiences. But real quick, to get back to the book, I want to talk to you a little bit, because I love this concept that you talk about, and that's in terms of stacking. You talk about going through and being able to stack the nutrients that we need for movement throughout the day. And you really make a point, I thought you made a great point, that stacking is very different than multitasking. So what do you mean by stacking, and how do you apply it to being able to add more movement?
Okay, well, let's start with multitasking, because so multitasking is this idea of like, oh man, I got 4 things I have to do today, and you're doing the things that you have to do every day to meet your needs. So you have to start with the fact that we all have needs. We've got work needs and family needs and personal needs and needs for rest and needs for food. Like, there's really tangible human needs that all humans have. Multitasking is looking at your list and going, I have 3 tasks to do today. So I'm going to try to do them all at the same time. I'm going to try to be with my kids on this walk, and I'm going to try to record this podcast or call someone on my phone while I'm being with my kids. And then we're also going to be in a grocery store. So we'll grocery store shop at the same time. I got my kids in the grocery basket, and I'm doing an interview or am talking to someone about something work, right? You're trying to do 3 different tasks. You're trying to do the phone call. You're trying to, you have to occupy your kids or whatever. And then you have to grocery shop. So it's like, you're not really doing all of them really well, because if you're on the phone, you're not really with your kids. I mean, proximally they are there with you, but you're not, it doesn't, I don't know if that really counts as the family time that you had, wanted to count it towards. And you're grocery shopping, but maybe you miss what's on your list because you're on the phone, and it's very stressful, because really they have found that you're never doing multiple things at once. You're just quickly switching between individual tasks. And so your brain is shutting down the other 2 tasks while you're on the 1 task. So you're really just sometimes doing 3 tasks poorly because you're trying to cram them together. Stacking is the idea of looking for a single task that meets multiple needs. So one example that I used in a different book a long time ago that might still be in this book too, I'm not sure, is, I have all the same things that everyone else has to do. So I was like, I feel undermoved, like I am someone who needs a lot of movement personally, and I believe that my children need a lot of movement, and I also am parenting. So wherever I go, they sort of have to go with me when I'm in that role. And like, we want to eat nutritionally, and then like, I got to go to the store to get food. So do I take it? Well, it's like very easily to get overwhelmed every single day. So I was just going, okay, well, the grocery store is really only like a mile from here. So we could walk that, and I'll get my groceries, and then like I'll get 2 mile walk. My kids will take a 2 mile walk. There's a tree along the way. And like we'll get some apples. I'll let them do that. Like that'll be the snack along the way. I mean, I just was like really put a lot of thought into it. And that's when they were very young. They were like 1 and 2, maybe 1.5 and 3. So we did our first ever single task, walk to the grocery store. And it was all of the things. And I never looked back from that moment. I was like, oh, that's what we're looking for, is tasks that humans used to do never involved so much of it. The task that we do now, the greater portion of the task is not the part that's meeting our need. The fact that we're on Zoom right now doing this, I'm meeting a work need, you're meeting a work need, but the Zoom part, the computer part is just like an ends to a means. You adding more computer time and me adding more computer time, those are actually moving us in the opposite direction. More and more tasks are like that. They involve getting into the car. They involve fuel to do the car. They involve the sitting in the car, the stimulation of the traffic, because you're in San Diego and I know what that's all about, right? So what I was looking for is the more stripped down, at least lesser sexy version, the slower version, the more organic version, if you will, of getting done what I needed to do. It wasn't me, I wasn't running for 2 miles. It was a 2-mile walk, but it ended up being 3 hours. It ended up being a 3-hour walk. I would have never thought that I had time to take a 3-hour walk. But if I did it with my kids, then I didn't need to hang out with them and play games in the evening when I was all done with my day. Like that one bout of time became long and luxurious because they were getting slow time with me. I was getting slow time with them. We could talk about learning. I mean, we could do, like, you could do time. I do times tables. I still do it with my kids now, but we'll do times tables. We'll do other things. Like I have to sit down and do my homework. I was like, no, you don't. Let's go. What do you need to learn? Spelling words? Great. We'll do that while we're outside, and you have sticks and are jumping around. And it does not have to be the seated version. It absolutely does not have to be for you to meet the objective of learning this information. And so it's just like that. It's thinking of what more enjoyable, more nutrient dense task can I pick instead of 5 tasks that stress me out and only nourish me each with like one small dose of a single vitamin.
Well, and I really like the way, what I thought you did a great job was really kind of build in, you're talking about going to the grocery store, but you also talk in kind of building in growing food and preparing food and really making that a crux of what you're doing so kids understand that there's a component to that. Because again, and right before we hit record, for listeners that have heard my interview with Dr. Ponser was talking about observing the tribes in Tanzania, and the women would go out. It is very interesting because you mentioned this specifically. The women would be out wearing the children on their back, going foraging for berries, for grubs. They would do that, and it'd be an intimate part, while the men would be out hunting for a lion or for whatever game they're going to go after that day for their food. So you had the family component kind of structured going out, and this is where we come from. That's the indigenous people doing it now in modern day Tanzania for their culture and sustenance. And so what I like about reading this now is you take that concept and bring it into the modern world and say, okay, maybe we're not going out foraging looking for the elephant, or maybe we're not going out. I kind of had this funny image of that interview, Katy, of wearing a loincloth into Whole Foods and going and poking a stick in the produce area to go find that. But why is making so with kids, and where I want to go with this is, so when you're with your kids and you're with your family, why is it so important to make the food, whether you're cooking, buying, shopping, as you just talked about, why is that so important to make that part of the process? What does that teach kids, and why is that so important in their development?
Oh gosh, well, I include it for so many reasons. I would say that the framework for Grow Wild, and where you get more movement, is really based on how humans have always gotten their movement, which is in being successful at living, at having a successful relationship with nature. So I really set up Grow Wild to say, we have our understanding of our culture, which is fairly small, but nature is a much bigger circle. Our culture is sitting inside nature. And what people who no longer really spend a lot of time in sourcing their life directly from nature, they have lost the understanding that we are still doing that. Everything, this computer came from nature. This building came from nature. The cars zooming by came from nature. They've all been extracted, built together like Lego, and put out in front of us. But the source material is still the same that the Hadza are gathering. So it looks quite different, but you need to recognize that the nuts and bolts are still the same. And also that we are the particular group that's not actually sourcing it. So the Hadza are really sourcing anything that they use directly. They have an understanding of the natural environment because their life sort of depends on it, where our sourcers are not us. We have paid, we don't even know the process. We just know, like, this cup just showed up in my house. I have no idea who made it.
Better we don't.
Yeah, well, and that's right. And I think that what you just said there so generously is, yes, we don't want to know where it comes from, because I think that we wouldn't feel the same way. And so what I'm trying to do is gently, because I am in this culture too, which is, I think that if we knew, we would many of us choose differently. So I'm going to start with food, because we all eat, and I don't know how to make a cup, but I know how to grow a salad, right? And so, like, I and probably the kids still now are at least sprouting a seed in a cardboard box in kindergarten, and at least like a smidge of that natural understanding, that learning has come through. And so what I'm trying to say is, the stability of our species is the same for the Hadza. It's how well can you survive in this environment? We have such technological advances, and our understanding of those have been completely outsourced. Like, most people don't know how a toilet works. They don't know where their water comes from. They don't know what makes it clean. They don't know what makes it dirty. That's a very precarious position to be in as a large, hyper-consuming mass of people. So it's just that, to say, when you start, and because we made these transitions for, we'll say, convenience, but I'll say that it was actually a simultaneous movement away from movement, is that what you end up teaching kids, like, say you say to your kids, especially if they're like, I'm going to say preteen, so like, let's say 8 to 10, 8 to 11. They're not the little kids anymore. Little kids will do anything that you say. They love you so much. They're like, what are you doing? That's what I want to do. But then there's a switch, right? There's a switch around 7 or 8 when they're like, I want to do what I want to do, which is fine. Yeah. But they still want to do what you want to do, as long as usually there's other kids doing it. So I've used that community aspect, that natural pressure of kids want to be with other kids, to be like, great, then you know what I'm going to have? My house is going to be the house for all the kids. Or I'm going to go take this hike and all of your friends are invited. Here, we're sending a text to 10 different kids. We'll throw them all in the car, not 10, but 6, and I will take them, because I'm perfectly fine, I'm perfectly fine manning or womaning or whatever it's called, taking care of, supervising, a large group of kids outside, because they're supervising themselves. All I get is a peaceful walk. They're not talking to me anymore, which is a parenting win, because I'm with them, but they don't really want to talk to me, talking, like, they're trying to grow in a stepwise fashion. I'm too far beyond where they are. The 7-year-old wants to know what the 8-year-old is doing, and the 8-year-old wants to know what the 10-year-old is doing. And so that multi-generational play, casual time, not sports, but still moving, still outside, still skillful, still balanced, still all the things that we're trying to recreate. So I really look for purposeful movement where you are increasing your skill set and understanding how the world actually works, not just your society, but how the world, the earth, circles back the things we need to us. And so, for those listening are like, I don't have a garden, I don't have space, I couldn't do this. It's like, if you told your 9-year-old, like, we're going to the garden shop or Home Depot or finding a community garden, and we're going to do this as a family, they will transition. Like, they really still want to be with you. And it's like, you can You and your friends can have a plot, or you can do this area, or draw. If you have you have to work with your kids' strengths. So if you have kids who are artists, or kids who are whatever their skill set is, convert the algebra of this garden project to their skill set. Oh, why don't you make a, if you have someone who just really loves tech or video, be like, I want you to high speed film us planting our garden today. You know what I mean? Like, like that's my skill set, is to try to find the way in for everyone there. There's a way to do it where everyone's, I'm not going to say excited, because I have kids and I know how that works. But as my husband says, your kids are going to whine regardless. Kids whine. Like that's their mechanism for getting your energy. That's what they're designed to do. So if you're going to whine, you might as well be doing what I want to do anyway. And so like that's our family sort of thing. And then it turns out that once you do it and everyone's engaged, everyone had a great day. No one was like, I wish I didn't do that.
Well, one of the things that my ex-wife does, kind of on that vein, is she's a group fitness. That's her part-time job. She teaches group fitness, and with the gyms being closed, she's been meeting some of the other women from her gym at a school parking lot where they each exercise in their own parking space. But they all bring their kids, and the kids are now old enough they don't need direct supervision. They have like the 9 and 10-year-olds watch the 5 and 6-year-olds, and so you have the group of moms over there on one side of the parking lot doing whatever workout they're doing, and then you have the kids over on the other side on their skateboards, their scooters, their bikes, just playing and being kids. And I think that's such a brilliant, I love that concept, because I think that ties in, it's to your point, it's talking about that stacking. They're getting the parent time together, they're getting, the kids are getting their movement time together, and they're doing their own self kind of peer-led movement. Now I want to wrap it up here, before I don't want to keep you too much longer, but one of the things I wanted to hear you talk about, because you did such a good job of that, and that's talking about, for listeners, you can't see me wiggling my hands. I'm doing jazz hands right now on YouTube. But why is it you make a big point talking about hands and engaging the hands? Because, and I'm going to tie this back to an interview I did years ago, maybe about the same time you and I first spoke. But John Wolf, who's the chief fitness officer of Onnit, talked about the reason why Onnit in their programming uses clubs, kettlebells, and ropes is our hands were not meant for technology. Our hands were not meant for keyboards. Our hands were not meant for phones and pads. So what can we do with kids? How can we get kids, and why is it so important to get kids using their hands to do what hands are meant to do?
Well, so what I start with this idea that grip strength is related to all-time mortality. Why it is, they're not sure, but they know that researchers can measure grip strength and see that there's an association between how strong your hands are and sort of how physically robust you will be overall. So there's that. Okay, the second piece is grip strengths are declining. They're on the decline, and so is health. And interestingly enough, in seeing that grip strength is declining, it's like, who's doing these measures? Usually OTs, occupational therapists are, because an OT, if you hurt your hand, or something happens, they have to be like, well, how strong am I? What do I need? Like, what's my quantifier of your hands are strong enough? So in exercise science measures, we would use hand dynamometers, right? So that's a thing that you grab and squeeze, and it measures your grip strength that way. So they're measuring it because they can say, well, here's the average grip strength. The reason someone else figured out that grip strength was declining is because they're going, okay, well, grip strength is lower in this generation coming up, the millennials, if you will. And so the response was really to decrease the norms of grip strength, to say, okay, well, now we only have to get people this strong because this is the norm, which is a very precarious way to use data like that. It's called a sliding baseline. Mm-hmm. So with biology, you don't really want your baselines to slide, or else it's really easy to miss other important data going on, which is everyone is getting weaker, and this measure seems to matter for some reason. We don't want to just then decrease it to say, like, well, that's how strong we're going to make people because that's how strong everyone else is. So that's kind of earlier to your question of counterculture, right? So if cultural norms have a role but biology and like the way nature is working is sort of sometimes outside of culture, oftentimes outside of culture. So my point is like, what, you know, they're trying to figure out why, you know, hands are getting stronger, weaker. And the general idea is like, well, kids used to have to pick up shovels and digging sticks and carry stuff and had a portion of contribution. I mean, the way kids learn how to be successful adults, and we can go to Hadza, is to make sure that they are developing the skill set. They have that juvenile period time to become robust adults. But we don't really see the role of kid time in that same way. We see it as something different. So we have stopped utilizing tools and movements. I mean, again, if we go back to our precarious, I mean, I swear, I felt like our monkey bars at school were like 8 feet tall. You know, when I was like 6, and like you would have to like leap. They didn't bother bringing it down. They're like, look, this has to get you and up to 14-year-olds. So is that your scar?
Yeah, I got a scar for YouTube viewers. I got a scar on top of my head from falling off monkey. Like I think they're like the 8-foot monkey bars at my elementary school.
Yeah.
Onto gravel. It wasn't like a soft, cushy rubber that we have now, but it was like gravel with hard edge concrete. And I forget what I was trying to do, but I came down. I was like 6 years old, and ended up in the emergency room getting 6 stitches in the top of my head.
Scrape a bolt on your way down. But yeah, I mean, it's just we need to get kids. So I say just create a small hanging station in your house. Like you don't even have to subscribe to like get me a nuts and bolts metal razor edge thing, you know, and let's get those back into society. It's like, is there a place for your kid to hang in your house? And they're very inexpensive and they're simple to do. And like, I imagine for your hanging daughter, the idea, like my kids will like do their thing, like whatever it is, more stationary, and then they'll run over and they're going to hang and they'll do it. Like they'll climb up the rope and down the rope, and then they go right back to doing it. They are really good at listening to their needs and getting them, but we're sort of training them out of it by creating an environment in which meeting their needs is not possible. So they just stop hearing that because there's nothing to do about it anyway.
Well, and I was gonna wrap up the conversation, Katie, by asking you to describe, because I love the images you put in there of various people's houses, and I do want to ask you about your images in the book in a second. But why is that dynamic environment? Because a friend of mine, a buddy of mine on the East Coast, Kelvin, if he's listening, and I know he listens to the podcast, but Kelvin recently sent me a shot. They put one of the high gymnastics bars in their house for their daughters. And I mean, it's like maybe 6 or 7 feet off the ground. I can't tell if he bought it or if he built it. He's mechanically inclined, so I'm sure he might have built it. But I've seen more and more people. I went to my accountant about 2 years ago, and in my accountant's house, she had a set of parallel bars, like in the living room. I guess her daughter was in gymnastics. And so I think there is a trend, Katie, you talk about in the book, and I think that parents are, whether it's to get their kids prepared for a specific sport or just to keep their kids active, but what can we do at home to try to create a more dynamic environment at home?
I mean, so Grow Wild is arranged in environments because each of those environments are important. And the first one is simply giving permission. I mean, it's the cultural environment. Movement is counterculture. So you don't even realize how many rules, like you don't even realize perhaps that maybe a main rule of your house is don't move that much. Stay quiet, don't jump. You know, so to really reflect and being like, oh yeah, I guess I really do not want them to move inside. I want them to move when they're not here, but they're always here. Okay, so you have to negotiate that. Okay, so the second thing would be space. We fill our houses with what I would consider non-essential stuff. You might like it, it might be sentimental, it might be beautiful, but if this is think of it as like a primate, like we're primates. We're in our zoo habitat, and you know, if you don't even realize how unstimulating it is because you've adapted to a little bit of movement and a lack of physical stimulation. That's the cultural norm for you, but it's not the norm for your DNA, and it's not the preference of your kids. You have to convert them over many years into being as sedentary as you are, and one of the conditioning ways we do that is by making a house so full of stuff you can't move safely anyway, including, you know, babies. So look at that and be like, do I need all this stuff in here? Calculate your chair to butt ratio of your house. How many butts are in your house and how many seats are there? And if you're starting to be like, well, 3 people or 4 people live here, but there are 37 places to take a seat and 0 places to do a cartwheel, that means that's a choice that you're making that you probably haven't tuned into, that you're making. So just make space. And the great thing is we probably all want to get rid of some stuff anyway. At least people listening to this podcast are like, I've been looking for a reason to sort of go minimal. But remember, minimalism is maximalism movement, right? Like, so when we talk about minimalism, we're talking about stuff. But the flip side of minimal stuff is maximum experience. And so if you've been wanting to figure out how to do it, I mean, do you have a blank wall? At the early or stages of the pandemic, when people are at home, I was like, do you have a place to roll out a yoga mat or something in your house? And they're like, oh, I don't have any space. And I was like, then that's step 1, is you need to make enough space for you to move in your own house, because it's the same phenomenon. We can't move in our houses. We can't move in our neighborhood. You have to go to the movement institutes, to be able to move. And it's just not necessary. It's just not necessary. And right now it's not practical. So this is a great time. Make some space. And then if you can get a few things, again, uneven parallel bars, and like these things, if people feel overwhelmed, it can be a 2x4 for balancing. It can be a chin-up bar. I mean, we're talking minimal, easy to move out of sight. Put a physio ball in, set up a floor desk. I mean, it's so simple and inexpensive to do. You just have to start by giving yourself permission, I think, really.
Well, it's funny you said that, because I got rid of my cable last year. One of the things I did was like trying to cut costs, and I still, I mean, admittedly, I still have like all the Netflix, Prime, whatever. But I find, Katy, that if I'm going to watch something on TV, I lay on the floor. It's not really that comfortable to sit on a couch. Or so as I was reading that section of the book, I was kind of giggling, because I'd much rather lay on the floor and wrestle with my dog a little bit, or put my feet up on an ottoman. And I'd get rid of one chair I have in my apartment, but it's become my dog's chair. My dog would probably get pretty mad at me. Yeah. I've pretty much ceded that to her. But I love the fact, what I loved of that you did in the book is you didn't just talk about your experience and what you've done. You integrated your community. Talk a little bit about where you got the pictures for your book, because you show a wide variety of options of how people are putting this concept into action. You're kind of, in Grow Wild, you're giving voice to, I think, a whole community, a whole movement that's literal movement that's happening out there. But talk a little bit about, if you could, where you got the images from that you use within your book.
Right. So it's really important for me professionally to not use stock images, because to me, if there's a stock image, it means that there's not an actual image of it being done. And I think that, especially when you're conveying important information and inspiration, so education and inspiration, but I think it's really easy. I mean, when you're doing something as a culture, you're sort of always looking for a way to not change. I mean, I think a lot of that has to do with change takes a lot of energy. So not changing might be a very human response. It's like, I don't want to overcome the inertia of everything. It's not efficient. It's more efficient for me to continue on the same path. And so I wanted to address really as many of the flags that we would throw in our own head, like, well, that's possible for you because where you live, but it's not possible for me because I live in a city. So I was like, right, we have to make sure that people understand that many people in the city do this. And then it's like, well, maybe this is an American thing, but it wouldn't work in this country. It's like, okay, well, we have to show a more international appeal. And then there's other things like, I don't know how I would do this because maybe I have one child with disabilities. And like, so instead of making these afterthoughts, I wanted to make sure I put them at the beginning to say, many people are doing this because actually something being counterculture is often a reason we don't want to do it. We don't want to be out there on our own, away from the group of people.
We don't want to be away from the herd, right? We don't want to be away from the tribe, because if you're away from the tribe, you're at a greater risk of being picked off. But something like this, I think it's essential to kind of like be the leader. If you're not in that natural environment, but to start being the leader within your peer group and say, hey, is there a way we can rethink this? Is there a way, maybe a way that we can do this a little bit better? And what's been the response? How do people, with people that have interacted with you on your blog or through things that you have done, when people kind of start making this transition and implementing these changes, what's been their response?
I mean, I think it's just really how easy it is. I mean, like you imagine a loincloth and a spear in Whole Foods, right? Like
Yeah.
we go to sort of the extreme of like, I can't do that in my own house. I could never do that. And it's like, well, I mean, what are we talking about? We're talking about pushing the stuff to the edge. I mean, it's not that extreme. And then I tried to tie up Grow Wild to say, like, as quaint or as retro as these ideas feel, they're totally relevant right now. They're totally relevant to the world climate. These are not unnatural things for humans to do. They're just simply things that we're not doing. I mean, it's really just that simple. And parents are like, I just started, I put a few stories in the book too of, I recommend, if you, it sounds like you like to go outside regularly and maybe do that with your kids. So the idea of, look, I got to get out of this house. I don't want to be in my house cooking dinner. I would love to cook dinner. I want to barbecue. So, and I'm going to go to this park and I will bring everything to start the barbecue. You just bring the food and you bring your kids and we'll meet a group. Sounds like your ex-wife was able to create something. It's a text. It's an idea and a text. It's not a party. You don't have to, it doesn't have to be fancy. You don't have to clean up. It's just life. It's just the way we've always done life. Groups of grown-ups sort of meeting their needs, groups of kids together, sort of safe in a cluster and getting what they do best. Everyone's getting a break from each other, which we are not getting right now very much. And so the response is really, I didn't think I would know how to do this, but once I started, I can't stop because it's meeting way more needs than you have had met in a long time. If you start a garden, if you teach yourself how to fish, if you have these moments with your partner or your children or your greater community, you realize, like, I didn't even know I was missing it. I didn't even know. So it's just that they just didn't know.
And I think that's powerful because, yeah, you hear this stuff and you're like, I can't really, wow, this sounds so much. But when you think about the steps of combining, of making, whether it's shopping or maybe running an errand and combining that. And that's where, I mean, just having, I spent most of my life, my adult life in cities, like in downtown Washington, D.C. or downtown Boston. So I'm still used to walking places. And that's still something, again, I've tried to carry over here where I'm living now, where there's a grocery store and there was a gym, but it closed down, not even a quarter mile out my door. I'm pointing out my door like people can see it, but because we can see it on the Zoom. But I really think a lot of that is just choices. And I do agree with you 100%, Katie, that if we stop, we take a moment, we look at what we're doing, and we think just a little bit more holistically, then it's like, well, walking to the store with my kids, you're right. We're knocking two or three things out at once. That way in the evening when they do spend a little bit of time by themselves, it's well earned. And I love that. So it's Grow Wild, where can people get it and how can people get more information about what you're doing and the whole movement community that you're creating?
Well, Grow Wild comes out May 3rd, and at that point, you should find it in your bookstores, and then your library. You can always ask your library to order it for you as well. You can get it on any place online. You can pre-order. I'm not sure when this will come out, but if it's before May 3rd, you can pre-order it and have it before then at growwildbook.com. And then if you just want to, if you want to sort of look at a lot of the ideas in action, I would say my Instagram, which is Nutritious Movement, is a great place to see, you can search the hashtags, let them move their DNA, which is really how you set up kid-centric movement places. It's based on Move Your DNA, which is the main grown-up book, I guess, if you will. And you can look up Furniture Free. Those are hashtags, and you can see sort of all the ways people are creating space within their home. And then the website, nutritiousmovement.com, just has everything. It's got all the books, the podcasts, the videos, hands down, there's 5 months worth of material that you can go through. I've been doing it for, 12 years of putting up articles and solutions. Really what I just try to offer are as many solutions to as many movement deficit related problems that I can think of. And I'm always putting them out. So that's a great place.
Well, in your natural training, Katie, is you're a biomechanicist, right? Your
Yeah.
natural study is biomechanics. Have you thought about doing any work in anthropology as the kids get a little bit older? I mean, to do something like a cultural anthropology to look at how can we engage people to be more active? I don't know. This is one of the things that popped to mind as I was reading through that.
Well, I would say, so I am a biomechanist. So a biomechanist is just someone who, I mean, I guess I shouldn't speak for all biomechanists. Or the training of a biomechanist is very, how do physical forces affect living systems?
Hmm.
I would say certainly just being an autodidactic person, um, I've grown to understand many other fields of movement through a lot of years of investigation. But really, I would say what I'm doing now, what I have coming up now, is more converting a lot of this. I mean, it's essentially a philosophical understanding. It's to understand, with Move Your DNA, we all call, like, if I'm moving around, I'm moving, but biomechanically, I would, and it was also philosophically, right? Because you're looking at levels, like your whole person is moving, but if you're sitting on a bicycle pedaling and your arms are holding on the handlebars, all of you is not really moving. And it's through that sort of what seemingly philosophical approach of like, what is movement? And if your whole person is moving, or all, so I, in one article, like a research article or journal article, was coining the term cellular sedentarism, right? So that's a big part of my work. And then the next piece that will come out is understanding why the distinctions between movement, physical activity, and exercise are so important to medicine. So it's anthropological in the sense of, I've spent a lot of years trying to write and create things on the individual level, because I think in the end, mandates or trying to help many, many different people understand big ideas on the mandate, like on the rules, creating rules so people understand them, or making sweeping prescriptions like move more. That one of the reasons we're not seeing people move more, but are seeing them move less, is that is not an effective communicative approach. Those communications are not working.
Hmm.
I am interested in why are they not working, but I'm not so much interested in researching it as much as just, I guess it's a natural experience of going, here's what I'm finding. I'm finding that when people understand this about movement, they're much more willing to take action. The idea that you're supposed to do it because it's good for you or fitness reasons, they're not landing cross-culturally. It's getting worse. And so that's probably how I will end up affecting people, is more through making sure that the science of movement is better understood at the ground level. We've sort of jumped over definitions and started telling people what they should be doing without really having a solid understanding of what the phenomenon was in the first place. So I'm really interested in clarifying the phenomenon of movement. And it just so happens that mechanics, because it's the same whether you're talking a cell or a whole person, turns out to be a great framework for that.